The pine forest surrounded Mike. As he walked deeper into the forest, rifles slung over his shoulder. He had heard rumors about these woods, tales of hunters who went missing, never to be seen again, but that didn't faze him. The promise of solitude and a prize buck kept him going. It was late afternoon, and the sun was barely cutting through the trees. The further he went, the darker it seemed to get. The air was thick with silence, except for the occasional rustle of leaves. As he scanned the area, he noticed something odd. The pine trees almost seemed to have faces. Twisted knots and knobbly bark creating the illusion of eyes and mouths. He shook his head, trying to push the eerie thought away. They were just trees. After hours of hiking, without seeing a single deer, Mike stumbled upon an old, run-down cabin nestled by a murky lake. The water was thick with mud, reflecting none of the sky above. It was strange, still almost unnatural. The cabin looked abandoned. Its wooden planks were rotting, and the door hung open at a crooked angle. With the sun dripping below the horizon, Mike decided it would be best to take shelter for the night. He approached the cabin slowly, every step making the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. There was a presence in the air, something that made his heart race. He felt like he was being watched. But when he turned to check the woods, the trees were just trees, no faces, just shadows playing tricks. He pushed the cabin door open with a creak, and the inside smelled of damp wood and decay. The furniture was scattered, a single chair, a table, and a bed frame with no mattress. There was something unsettling about how untouched everything looked, like someone had left in a hurry. Suddenly, thump, something hit the cabin roof. Mike's heart jumped into his throat. He quickly raised his rifle and listened, but the sound didn't repeat. His breath came in shallow gasps as he inched toward the window. He looked outside, scanning the darkness. Nothing, just that muddy lake and thick, silent woods. But then he saw it, just at the edge of the tree line, a shadow. It was tall, human-like, but wrong somehow. It was almost as if it didn't belong in the world of flesh and bone. The figure stood still, staring at the cabin. Mike blinked, and in that instant, the shadow vanished. He closed the window shutters with a slam, his heart pounding in his ears. "Get a grip," he muttered to himself, though his hands shook. Night fell hard and fast. Mike set his rifle next to the chair and sunk into it, trying to convince himself that it was just the wilderness playing tricks on him. But his nerves refused to settle. The wind outside picked up, howling against the cabin walls, and then scratch, scratch. Something scraped along the outside of the cabin slowly. He froze, eyes wide, his breath caught in his throat. The sound moved, circling the cabin. It stopped just behind the wall where Mike sat. His hand reached out to grab his rifle, but before he could touch it, bang! Something slammed against the window shutter, the force of it nearly shaking the whole cabin. Mike jumped to his feet, gripping his gun tight. "Who's there?" he shouted. Slowly he approached the window, rifle at the ready. He placed his hand on the shutter, and with a deep breath, flung it open. Nothing was there. The moon reflected off the lake's muddy surface, casting an eerie glow over the clearing, but there was no sign of movement. The trees stood still, their faces, no, not faces, just knots in the wood. He was about to close the shutter when two glowing eyes blinked back at him from across the lake. Mike stumbled backward, heart racing. The eyes were too high off the ground, much taller than any animal should be. They stared at him for what felt like eternity, before slowly vanishing into the darkness. A sudden knock echoed through the cabin, not at the door, but on the roof. Slow thumps. He pointed his rifle upward, his hands trembling. Then bam! The cabin door flew open, slamming against the wall. Cold air rushed inside, extinguishing the lone candle he had lit. In the pitch black, Mike's breath quickened as something heavy moved inside the room. He could hear it breathing, a low rasp, like something not quite human. He slowly backed up until his heels hit the cabin wall, his hands reaching for his flashlight, and when he finally clicked it on, the beam landed on the far corner of the room. A figure stood there, tall, haggard, its skin scratched tightly over its bones. Its eyes were hollow, glowing with an unnatural light, and its mouth hung open in a silent scream. It moved forward, its legs barely bending as it glided across the floor. Mike's body froze. He raised his rifle, but the thing was faster. It lunged at him, its cold, bony hands reaching out. In that moment, he fired. The flash lit up the cabin for a split second, and the thing vanished. No body, no blood. The door slammed shut, trapping him inside with only the echo of his own panicked breathing. He stumbled out the cabin moments later, rifle in hand, and sprinted into the woods. Behind him, the cabin stood silent once more, a dark figure standing just within the shadows of the doorway, watching as he disappeared into the night. The last sound Mike heard before the trees swallowed him whole was a chilling, whispered laugh, carried on in the wind, the laugh of the Phantom Stalker. It was a cold, crisp Halloween evening, the kind that made the shadows seem to stretch a little too long, and every house felt just a little bit too dark. 3 kids, Ethan, Lily, and their best friend Josh, were making their way through the neighborhood, hitting house after house for candy. They had a system. Ethan knocked, Josh held the bag, and Lily would say trick or treat in her best spooky voice. It was perfect. They'd been doing this for years, ever since they were old enough to go out alone. But this Halloween, they decided to take a detour down a street they normally avoided. At the end of the street, looming like a ghost in the distance, was an old, abandoned house. Everyone in the neighborhood knew about it. It was run down, covered in ivy, and the windows were boarded up. No one ever saw anyone there, except tonight. As they approached, the porch light was on, flickering dimly, like it could go out any second. A tall, thin man with a creepy smile stood in the doorway. He was pale, his clothes wrinkled, his eyes almost too wide. In one hand he held a candy bowl, but something about him felt wrong, like he didn't belong. The 3 kids hesitated, staring at the man. "I don't like this," whispered Lily, clutching her plastic pumpkin full of candy. "It's just a house," Josh said, though he didn't sound as confident as usual. Ethan shrugged, always the brave one. "Come on, let's just do this. It's the last house, and then we're done." They walked up the creaky steps, the boards groaning beneath their feet. The man didn't say a word, just stared at them with that unnerving grin. Up close, his skin looked strange, like it didn't quite fit his face. "Trick or treat," Ethan called out, forcing a grin, but his voice wavered. The man extended the candy bowl, and Ethan, without thinking, reached in. The second his hand touched the candy, the man's cold fingers grabbed his wrist. Ethan gasped, jerking his hand away, and the candy fell to the ground. The man's smile grew wider, his eyes narrowing with a strange hunger. "Run!" Josh yelled, pulling Lily with him as they sprinted off the porch. Ethan was right behind them, his heart pounding in his chest. But as they reached the end of the driveway, they heard a loud thud from behind them. All three turned, panting just in time to see the front door slam shut. "Forget it. Let's just go home," Josh muttered, glancing back nervously. The three didn't say a word as they hurried home, and tension hanging in the air like a thick fog. The next day, everything seemed normal. The kids went to school, their bags heavy with Halloween candy. But none of them mentioned the creepy man or the house. They didn't want to think about it. That night, as Ethan lay in bed, something didn't feel right. He tossed and turned, unable to shake the feeling of the man's cold grip on his wrist. Tap, tap, tap. Ethan froze. The sound was coming from his window. His heart raced, and his stomach twisted with fear. Slowly he turned his head toward the window. A figure stood outside just beyond the glass, tall, thin, smiling. It was the man. Ethan screamed, but the figure was gone. His parents rushed in, flipping on the lights, but the yard outside was empty. "He must have had a bad dream," his mom said gently, rubbing his back. But Ethan knew it wasn't a dream. A week passed, and then Halloween became a memory. Ethan, Josh, and Lily hadn't talked about the house since that night. But then, one morning, Josh didn't show up for school. He didn't answer his phone. No one had seen him. By nightfall, Josh's parents were frantic, calling neighbors, friends, and eventually the police. Ethan and Lily sat on the porch of Ethan's house, staring at the flashing red and blue lights in front of Josh's home. "Do you think?" Lily began, but her voice trailed off. Ethan shook his head, but deep down he felt it too. Something was wrong. Something had followed them from that house. Days turned into weeks, and Josh was never found. The police searched everywhere, but there was no trace. Ethan's mind kept drifting back to that night. The man, the house, the way Josh had screamed as they ran. The police had even gone to the house, but they found nothing. No man, no sign of anyone living there. The strangest part, according to the police, the house had been abandoned for over 30 years. No utilities, no records of anyone renting it, nothing. Ethan and Lily stopped visiting the old neighborhood after that. They couldn't shake the feeling that something still lingered there. The kind of thing you couldn't see, but you could feel it watching, waiting. And on every Halloween, Ethan would remember the way Josh looked that night, standing on that rickety porch before the door slammed shut behind them. They never found Josh, and they never figured out who or what had been living in that house. But Ethan knew one thing for sure. He would never go back, not even to trick or treat. It was a quiet Wednesday night, well past midnight. The lights buzzed faintly, casting a sickly glow over the Sheetz gas station. Inside, Steve was finishing up his shift, just like he had for years, with his dirty apron tied around his wrist. He was the guy who kept the place running. The customers loved him, always smiling, always willing to make a fresh sub or refill coffee with a friendly word. His co-workers, they were laid back, almost too easygoing. Jenny, the cashier, usually spent her shift scrolling on her phone, and Mark, the cook, liked to sneak out for smoke breaks. The place ran smoothly, or so it seemed. But there was one problem. Someone had been stalking the store. A tall man in a black hoodie came in almost every night. He never bought anything, just looted near the aisles, eyeing the staff with strange intensity. Jenny had mentioned him once or twice, but Steve brushed it off. "Just another bored night owl," he said with a grin. Tonight the stalker was back, His shadow loomed over the snack aisle, watching silent as ever. Steve wiped the counter, feeling the man's eyes on him, but pretending not to notice. The clock read 2:30 a.m. Mark was supposed to be back in the back preparing food, but he hadn't come out in a while. Steve glanced at the door to the back room, then shrugged. Maybe he was taking one of his infamous long smoke breaks again. Suddenly there was a sound from the back, a heavy thump like something falling. Jenny perked up from behind the register. Did you hear that? Steve waved it off. Probably, Mark. You know how clumsy you can be. But Jenny frowned, a shiver running down her spine. I don't know, Steve. Something feels off. Before she could investigate, the stalker moved fast. He walked straight to the door leading to the back room. Steve's smile faded for the first time. Hey, what are you doing back there? But the stalker didn't stop. He yanked the door open and disappeared into the dark hallway behind his door. Steve cursed under his breath. Stay here, he muttered to Jenny as he followed after the man, fists clenched. In the back, the lights flickered sinisterly. The coolers hummed softly, and everything felt too still. Steve spotted the stalker at the end of the hall, staring at something on the ground. Steve approached, his heart racing. You've got no business back here, he yelled, ready to confront the intruder. But as he stepped closer, he saw what the man was looking at. Mark's body lay crumbled on the cold floor, eyes wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling. His throat was slashed, blood pooling around him. Steve froze, the air thick with the coppery scent of death. I knew it, the stalker said in a low voice, turning towards Steve with a look of grim determination. I knew it was you. Steve blinked, taking a step back. What are you talking about? The stalker took a step forward, revealing something in his hand. A blooded ID badge. It was Mark's. The stalker's voice was steady, eerily calm. You've been killing them one by one. I've been watching you. Steve's friendly facade cracked. He sighed, almost disappointed. You weren't supposed to find this, he muttered. In a flash, Steve grabbed a knife from the prep table. There was no fear in the stalker's eyes. Why, Steve? The stalker asked, his voice steady. Why do this? Steve smiled again, but this time it wasn't friendly. It was cold and unemotional. They're too soft, too lazy. I carry this place on my back, and they just float through life. They don't deserve to be here. The stalker narrowed his eyes, gripping something in his pocket. They weren't lazy, Steve. They trusted you. Before Steve could lunge, the stalker whipped out a taser and fired. The shock sent Steve crashing to the ground, convulsing. He dropped the knife, his body twitching wildly. The stalker quickly tied Steve's hands behind his back with a zip tie, his breath heavy but controlled. He leaned down, staring at Steve's face. I've been following you for weeks. I saw the others. This is the end. As Steve lay there, unable to move, Jenny burst into the back room, her face pale with terror. What the hell is going on? The stalker looked at her, his eyes tired but relieved. Call the cops. Steve's been taking care of his co-workers. Jenny's eyes widened, and for the first time she saw Steve for what he really was. A monster. The stalker gave a final glance at Steve, who lay helpless on the floor, and then spoke softly. I wasn't stalking the store. I was stalking him. Jen and Jill were best friends who had been working the night shift at McDonald's for a few months. It was easy money, and the quiet hours made the job bearable. Most of the time, it was just the two of them closing up while the unusual creepy regulars came in for late night fries. But recently, Jane had noticed something strange. Jerry, one of their co-workers, had started working the same shifts. He was quiet, kept to himself, and always seemed to be lurking in the back near the freezers. He had this weird grin like he was always hiding something, but Jane figured he was just odd. One night, it was especially slow. The lights in the dining area flickered every so often, and the greasy smell of the fryer hung heavily in the air. Jill was at the counter, scrolling through her phone while Jane restocked the sauces. "You think Jerry's weird?" Jane whispered to Jill, glancing toward the kitchen, where Jerry was chopping lettuce, though he didn't seem to be making any salads. Jill shrugged. "Weird. He's a total creep. I don't know why the manager keeps him around." Suddenly they heard a thud from the back. Jane and Jill exchanged glances. "What was that?" Jill asked, her voice shaky. "Probably just Jerry doing Jerry things," Jane muttered, though her stomach turned with uneasiness. The thud came again, but this time it was much louder. "Come with me," Jane whispered, grabbing Jill's arm as they crept toward the back. They passed the fryers, the ice cream machine, broken as always, and finally they reached the walk-in freezer. Jane hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the cold seeping through the metal door. "Should we?" Suddenly Jerry appeared from the shadows, his pale face illuminated by the flickering kitchen lights. His grin was wider than ever, and in his hand he held a large knife, glistening under the lights. "What are you two doing back here?" Steve asked, his voice low, almost playful. Jill gasped, stepping back. We heard something." Jerry's grin never faltered. "Just finishing up a special order?" Jane's stomach tightened as she noticed something behind him. A large trash bag, dripping with something dark red, too dark to be ketchup. "Special order?" Jane echoed, her voice shaky. Jerry's eyes gleamed. "Yeah, for the Happy Meals. They want something fresh." Jane's blood ran cold. She grabbed Jill's arm tighter, her heart pounding. "What's in the big bag, Jerry?" Jerry stepped closer, his grin now almost missing. "You're too curious for your own good. Jane, maybe you should help me with the next batch." That's when Jane saw it, a human hand, pale and limp, sticking out from the edge of the trash bag. Jane screamed, caught in her throat, as the reality hit her like a punch in the gut. Jerry wasn't just weird, he was killing people and using them for Happy Meals. Jill stumbled back, her hand over her mouth, eyes wide with horror. "What the hell is wrong with you?" she said. Jerry's smile vanished, replaced by a cold, dark look. "You weren't supposed to find out." Jane's survival instinct kicked in. She grabbed the first thing she could, a heavy metal tray, and slammed it into Jerry's face. He stumbled, dropping the knife as blood gushed from his nose. Without wasting a second, Jane grabbed Jill's arm, and they bolted toward the front of the restaurant. "The doors! They just need to make it to the doors." Behind them, Jerry let out a low growl, the sound of his footsteps closing in. Jane's heart raced as she pushed through the swinging kitchen door, dragging Jill with her. "We need to get out of here," Jane shouted. They reached the entrance, but the door was locked. Jane fumbled with the keys in her apron pocket, her hands shaking so hard she could barely grasp them. "Hurry!" Jill screamed, glancing back at the kitchen. Steve's shadow loomed closer. Finally, Jane jammed the key into the lock and yanked the door open. The two girls sprinted into the night, not stopping until they were far from the glowing McDonald sign, their breath ragged, hearts pounding in their chests. They stopped at the gas station down the road, hiding behind a stack of newspapers as they called the police. Jane couldn't stop shaking, her mind racing with the horrific images of the freezer, of Jerry's sickening grin. By the time the police arrived, Jerry had vanished. The kitchen and freezer had been cleaned out, the trash bags gone. There was no trace of him or his gruesome special order. Jane and Jill never went back to that McDonald's again, and neither of them ever ate a Happy Meal again. Because now they knew the secret, and it wasn't something you could ever forget.